Hi, everyone. Dr. David Hall here. Today, we're going to talk about the idea of anti-fragility. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. We are called in Scripture to grow in the context of challenges. And there's some really interesting science behind that in the worlds of behavioral health, of not just of how we can be resilient, but how friction and even difficulty causes us to grow and to thrive. That's what we're going to get into today. Let's slide into that intro music.
Welcome to Church Psychology, a podcast of the Negev Institute. We are mental health professionals looking at the intersections of social and behavioral science in the Christian life. Please connect with our free resources in our open community library at churchpsychology.org. We would be grateful if you would follow, like, or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you are finding us, and also leave us a review. As we start, if we are to love the Lord our God with all of our mind, it makes sense to work on our headspace. So let's get to work. Well, welcome everybody to the Church Psychology Podcast. My name is Matt Schuneman. I'm here with Dr. David Hall. Hey, David.
Hey, Matt.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
We're back with another episode, and I'm looking forward to this one. More for your thoughts than mine.
As opposed to the other episodes where, I was just dreading. We
Yeah, I
got to
didn't
get
like
it
them.
done.
I didn't like them. I just had to, we do that at work sometimes where we don't want to do certain things, but we do them because we got to get paid.
That's true.
No,
I
loved every conversation that we have had up until this point.
I'll try.
But
not
I
to
am really
disappoint.
looking forward to this one. So, David,
Yes.
you and I both enjoy a book.
Yeah.
That is super heady.
It's on your shelf, isn't it?
It is. I actually have it right here.
Put it up.
The
'Cause
book
those watching
is
on YouTube
called,
can see it.
I hope it's not like backwards, but this is the book. It's called Anti-Fragile by, say his name for me, Nassim
Taleb.
Taleb. Thank you. It's an interesting concept. I was first introduced to this book years ago before you and I met, David, and I think it was something that a friend of mine really valued as it relates to the general concept being a third option between fragility and resiliency, and what he calls anti-fragility. And obviously we'll get into all of that, but just as a precursor to that conversation, I felt like it was such a good discussion. At least he lays out a lot of scientific knowledge, a lot of things as it relates to even business world and stocks and all that kind of thing. But for you and I, David, I think we talk about it in the realm of our podcast and our integration of faith and mental health. Kick us off, I guess, in regards to why this book and the concept of anti-fragility is an important one that we talk about today.
Sure. So some context on the author, Nassim Taleb. His background is as a mathematician and works in economic spaces. He had a book that came out called Black Swan in the late 2000s that was about his basically anticipating the financial crisis that happened in the late 2000s and of how pressure and chaos and the unpredictable, and he recognizes that in economics and mathematics, and we would say the same in mental health.
Yeah.
That people are always trying to kind of control things and oftentimes control to the end of the ends they're trying to get to is to avoid distress. And he wrote this book, Anti-Fragile, to talk about this concept as it applies more generally in life.
Yeah.
So Matt alluded to this idea of there are three concepts. One, the first concept is the idea of something being fragile, in that it is something that is easily broken and hard to repair.
Mm-hmm.
And another concept that has traditionally been talked about quite a bit in mental health has been resiliency. This idea that something that is more resistant to damage. So whereas you may think of something fragile, it's this porcelain figurine. It's easy to chip, easy to break, shatter, all that. Whereas something resilient may be a well worn in baseball glove. It can, you could be rough with it, or it's a pickup truck, or it's any number of things that
Yeah.
don't get easily damaged. And in mental health, there's often been a discussion of how do we make kids resilient, how we make marriages resilient, and resiliency is a good thing in so many concepts and in so many contexts, and the concept of it is good.
Right.
Anti-fragile though is not it's not even just super resiliency. It's the realm of things, whether physical, relational, what have you. It's the realm of things that require distress to thrive. It's not just
Mm.
that they withstand distress.
Mm.
They need distress to thrive. And some
Mhm.
examples of this in the physical world. If you are bedbound for some reason, one of the things that healthcare professionals are concerned about is atrophy
Yeah.
of your muscles, of your breathing functioning. Because if you do not work your muscles, they atrophy, they shrink, they become less
Mhm.
strong.
Mhm.
Muscles need distress to thrive. When you are exercising, what's actually happening on a biological level is you are tearing your muscles when you're lifting weights, or
Yeah.
you're doing
Right.
you're actively damaging your
Right.
muscles, and they knit back together, and in the process of that, they develop greater strength.
Mm.
And this concept, I believe, and Matt also thinks, is a hugely important one in regards to mental health, because and there's a lot of people that have written about this, specifically the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who's written quite a bit
Yeah.
on
I may have that book too. If
yeah,
I'm
that's a
gonna
book
pull it up.
yeah, there's a book of his that references the work of Taleb quite a bit, is a book that he wrote with free speech advocate Greg Lukianoff, called
Yeah.
Coddling of the American Mind. And Matt
Here's
has
this
that on his
one.
screen. Yeah, Coddling of the American Mind, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. And that book is about how we have weakened socially
Yeah.
uh, this rising generation of young adults and teens. And there are lots of concepts that Haidt and Lukianoff delve into in their book, and Haidt in other work that he's written. But specifically, it's this idea that things have been treated as fragile when they were actually anti-fragile. And that's a big deal, because if you treat something in the wrong category,
Mm.
it will be highly detrimental to it. If you have something that is actually anti-fragile and treat it as fragile, where you don't expose it to distress, it withers.
Yeah. Mm.
And there is, in a lot of the social psychology space, there's been a lot of analysis of how, with rising rates of anxiety and depression, might one of the explanations of this be that we have taken something in the sense of the emotional development, particularly of young people. But you can apply this a lot of places, but that the
Yeah.
emotional development of young people,
Mm.
we have treated them as fragile beings, relationally, physically, and so on. And because of that, it has made them more fragile, when in truth, we need to be treating these things as anti-fragile, things that need distress to thrive.
So, a common, um, name that you may have heard for parenting, 2 actually common names for parenting that you may have heard is the, helicopter parent or the lawnmower parent, or there may be another one for that one. So on one hand, you have the parent that circles around their kid, not allowing any obstacle to come and touch them. No pain. They want to consistently protect. And then the lawnmower parent is the one that actually goes out in front of their kid and blows up any obstacles that could potentially harm them. And as a parent, I must admit that there is a strong natural pull to protect my kids from harm or try to make life, in a sense, as easy as possible for them. The problem with that is that, as anti-fragility, this whole concept is talking about, is that if there are no obstacles to grow strength from, then, as you've said, the children grow more weak as it relates to anything that does come in the future. So
Mhm.
maybe under the environment of the system that has been created in the home, they thrive. But usually, when they exit the home at 18 or at some point thereof, they hit a ton of obstacles and they don't know how to handle them.
I would
And I
challenge
think,
even yeah,
well, I was going to
go
say
on.
is that I think that there's a level to why there's more of a failure to launch for many young
Mhm.
people as of late. Go ahead.
What I was starting to say is I would even challenge the idea that even in the protected environment of the home, are they thriving? And it depends, I
Fair.
guess, what we're looking at that. Like, they may their life may be sustained, but is it being sustained by parents or other caregivers that are keeping it going artificially in some ways,
Right.
versus can it really stand well on its own? And, Taleb really highlights this idea of you need variability and volatility and stress and even a certain amount of disorder
Mm.
for so many things to go well. He comes it from a economic standpoint,
Yeah.
but that economically, for a lot of things to thrive, you need this. It needs to, in some ways,
Mm.
be hard.
Mhm.
And this is an interesting thing when you study economies. There are a lot of economies that uh, material wealth. They have a way to access material wealth that's pretty easy. A classic example of this is things like Gulf states in the Persian Gulf. They have oil and natural gas reserves, relatively small citizen populations, and so they're able to, and that it's a commodity that has a high value, and so
Mm.
because of that, they're able to quote make things easy economically, at least for citizens of these countries.
Right.
Whereas you have some other countries, Singapore is an interesting example. Very small, doesn't have natural resources, but in that distress, they have created thriving economies that are dynamic and
Mm.
adaptable.
Mm.
But it doesn't happen in spite of difficulty, according to the anti-fragile mindset. It happens because of difficulty.
Yeah.
And that when something is made too easy, it
Mhm.
impairs the thriving of the thing. And
Mm.
so and it's very counterintuitive to a
Yeah.
lot of how we've been culturally shaped. We've been shaped in ways in this to reinforce the belief that distress is bad, always bad.
Yeah.
And the ideal, and speaking to parents as you've brought that up, Matt, that a lot of parents have taken on is it's my job to make things as easy for my children as possible because that is what will let them thrive in the world.
Yeah. I mean, have we always thought that way? I feel like this is a newer concept. And maybe, again, sometimes we talk like science, but there's a level to which I feel this wasn't maybe common before the 1950s. I
Even later than that, it's
Yeah.
the it 1980s is when a lot of stuff began coming in, and I think some of it there's so many different things in generational dynamics. One level of it you can look at is that in a less materially advanced society, parents often don't have the margin
Right.
to uh, to try to manage their kids' lives in these ways because
Mm.
there isn't the economic
Yeah.
capacity for a parent
Yeah.
to have that much attention on it. But I think some of it is that we deal with an excess of information. And there are lots of reasons why we could say we've embraced this fragile mindset. But uh Haidt in his work, Jonathan Haidt highlights that in the 1980s there was a lot of moral panic about kids being abducted.
Right.
And it did happen. And so because of that, whereas before kids were a lot more free range,
Mhm.
there was this sense of need for parents to keep much closer tabs on their kids. And uh, around the same time, that began happening in the late 80s and into the 90s with the advent of cell phone technology.
Right.
Being able to keep tabs on your kids, being able to keep track of the different family members was a lot easier.
Mm.
And a classic example I give of this is because I'm old enough where I kind of have lived in the transition period of this. But I
Yeah.
remember a
Yeah.
time in my life very clearly where no one had cell phones. The only person I knew that had a cell phone when I was a young kid was Zach Morris in Saved by the Bell. He had the big brick
Yeah.
cell phone.
Yes. Yes.
And but I would call a friend's house. I would call my friend Aaron, and it
Do you
would be his
remember
line.
them? I mean, do you remember their phone numbers?
Some of them,
There's some I still remember, or at least I
yeah.
remember the pattern of how you dial it.
Yeah, and because I had to remember, like,
Yeah.
even my first cell phone, my first cell phones were in high school for me, but you didn't save numbers yet, and so I still
Mm.
had to know people's phone numbers, and
Mhm.
yeah, I could probably, uh, I don't know whose numbers are still the same, so I'm not gonna put them
No,
out
it's
on a
not the same
podcast.
anymore,
Yeah,
but
but anyway, but I would dial a friend's home,
right.
and almost no one I knew had an answering machine,
Mm.
and so the phone would ring, and either someone would pick up or not, and or Aaron's mom would pick up and, "Oh, is Aaron there?" "No, David, he's out." I'll tell
Mhm.
him you called, and he may or may not call me,
Yeah.
and I didn't necessarily stress that much about it because that was just the rhythm of the lives we lived in. But now I'll do this thing where I'll call my wife expecting that she'll be able to respond to me, or I'll text her, and
Yes.
how long do I wait before I get a response where I start panicking and wondering.
Panicking.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and technology is and so this is really technology driven. There are lots of things to it, but we're constantly being given tools to manage. And I guess that's the thing of parents can uh, observe and in some ways intervene in their kids' lives through technology
Yeah.
in ways that was not possible before. So we don't necessarily try to run a system that's impossible to run.
Right, and I want us to be careful too not to go down the path that says, like, all this technology is bad. There are systems that have been put in place that keep us overly, observant of our children, but some levels of observation, especially in the aspect of phone technology in young people, uh, to some level, parents should have some access to what they are looking at or what they are doing, to have some tabs of, I know that one popular app is Life 360, of like to know where our child is or to know where my spouse is. Like at all times, I can like pull it up on my phone and I can see where she's at, or whatever. Have some benefits to it, but at the same time, it is this almost over knowledge, um, that doesn't allow us to sit within the
Mhm.
question marks at times.
I mean, I would agree absolutely with what you're saying, man. That there most technological innovations that I've seen, at least in my lifetime, feel double edged.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
that there's certainly benefit because I have a smartphone, and every once in a while, I will think of like, do I want to go dumb phone? Do I want to just go back to a flip phone to a simpler time?
Yeah.
And I don't know if I might. I know people that have, and for good reason, and I could see there being benefit. But there's big convenience. I really appreciate like online food orders.
Oh,
I
yeah.
really appreciate the there are lots of benefits I find in my life, and you talk about relationally too. Like absolutely that I am a absolute proponent that if you have a child that or a young adult that is in your home that you have responsibility for, and they have smart devices, that you absolutely should be in that. You
Yeah.
absolutely should, have access to that. And
Yeah.
it's even less about monitoring what kids are doing and things like that, but it's the everything from uh, managing conflict,
Hmm.
uh, how a lot of kids are trained to manage conflict is to invoke an adult or some authority figure, whether that's a parent or a teacher. And the the research shows that conflict resolution skills are greatly declining.
Hmm.
And we even see it in things like cancel culture or public shaming. It becomes you do something I disagree with or I take issue with.
Yeah.
And so how I manage that is I try to pull other people or other forces onto my side, if you
Right.
will.
Yeah.
And that's how I manage it versus how do I speak to somebody directly? And I mean, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds because it's one thing if this is somebody that isn't in your lived, inhabited life. You're having conflict with somebody online that you don't actually know in the physical world. But
Mhm. Right.
but this is everything from like conflict within school to, I was talking with somebody fairly recently who where Matt and I live is uh, where the University of Tennessee
Mhm.
main campus is in Knoxville, Tennessee. And in our counseling practice, there are a lot of college students that come through. And so I get glimpses into the lives of college students and the amount of social management the parents are, I find, doing in their kids'
Mm.
lives
Mhm.
is, and some of it is because they can,
Right.
because parents are in Facebook groups with other parents of freshmen at UT. And, so they can do that. And it's what their friends are doing. So there's a sense of it being peer normalized. And I want to be very clear that in what we're talking about now and in anything we talk about, the goal is not to kind of parent shame or anybody shame and like, well, you're doing it wrong. But in the context of our conversation today of anti-fragility is what's led us there. And I think the
Yeah.
simplest form is we have far more knowledge than we used to in the sense of information. And we
Mhm.
have a lot more avenues to take action with this knowledge. And we have not been cultivated in or discipled to believe that we shouldn't interfere. In fact, we've been told quite the opposite, that if you're a
Mhm.
good parent, you're stepping in to block
Mhm.
these blows coming in on your kid because that is what a
Yeah.
good parent does.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll admit my own struggle is to be as present as possible, and to be as involved as possible. But in the context of what we're talking about, even my children at young ages need, um, to handle situations in ways to learn through the quote unquote crucible of that conflict of if I do this, this is the result, or if I do this, this is the result. Like there's a level to which, as we talk about this, that any type of uh, what were the phrases? Pressure, um,
Stress, disorder,
stress, disorder.
volatility.
Yeah, that they can be things that grow us or strengthen us. I think about you probably mentioned this, or you did mention this earlier, but the concept of exercise, um, or weight training, there is a level that sucks. Like you are hurting after you do it, but the more you do it, the stronger you get, and then you put on more pressure, you put on more volatility, you put on more, and so you grow in strength through the difficulty of the exercise. And so I use that often sometimes, well, not often, but I sometimes use that in conversations with clients or other people that are wrestling with this difficulty, and not seeing it as a potential growth opportunity, such as what anti-fragility I think is alluding to.
Church Psychology is a production of the Negev Institute, a research, resource, and teaching initiative that aims to provide Christian communities with practical education and consulting to faithfully speak to our needs in mental health, relational science, and human habit and behavior. A great way to support Negev is to start a free membership in our open community library at churchpsychology.org, and then stay connected with our email newsletter to hear about new classes, publications, live forums, and in-person events. Again, you can find all that at churchpsychology.org. We've talked about culturally in the wider cultural space. We have equated all distress with trauma,
Mm,
and that is inaccurate. That is not what trauma is. Trauma is an experience that creates uh, in us an inability to move forward.
Yeah.
A traumatic event happens to us, and what defines it as traumatic is not the level of how distressing it is. It's how well we are able to process and move through it.
Correct.
And traumatic events are events that we get stuck in some ways, and we are not able to healthily progress past them. And that is not how trauma is talked about. Trauma is talked about as anything that feels really difficult. But
Yeah.
we can go through deeply difficult experiences and it doesn't register as trauma. The same way that you can go through an experience that isn't necessarily very distressing compared to other experiences, but it could register as trauma because of your ability to process it. Uh, and you talk about exercise, Matt. Another great example that I think is easy for a lot of people to grasp is a young child learning how to walk.
Right.
They've got to, parents have to give them the space to struggle and sometimes fall a little bit. And
Mhm.
because if you don't, that child does not develop the coordination or the muscle strength to be able to walk. And if the end result is I want my child to be able to walk, I have to be willing to tolerate a certain distress in them and even
Mm.
myself by watching them. And
Right.
this is hard. Like I had my cat in the vet this week, and I hate doing that because she hates going to the vet.
Mhm.
And, I nab her and get her in her cat carrier, and she's crying at me, and I feel so guilty. Even though I know that she needs to get a checkup,
Uh-huh.
that she doesn't understand that, and I just feel bad, and that's something, but I acknowledge in that the greater good, the higher good
Mm.
is doing this even though it's uncomfortable in the moment. So,
Mm.
let's
Yes.
look at some scriptural examples for this.
Yeah.
So, you've got this, and for you to read the first one, Matt. So, and as an example of how we as Christians should frame and consider distress. And so this is
Mm.
James 1, 2 through 4.
So this says, "Consider it great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. But endurance must do its complete work, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing."
Mm. And to add to this, I'll read this. This is Romans 5, 3 through 4. And not only that, but we also rejoice in our afflictions, because we know that affliction produces endurance, endurance produces proven character, and proven character produces hope.
Mm.
Now let's contextualize this some. In both of these instances, it is talking about kind of the testing of our faith even.
Right.
And to uh, it is not to say that everything difficult that anyone goes through is in itself a good thing.
Mm.
But there's this frame that we're given that it is not in spite of trials or difficulty or distressing things, but is
Mhm.
because of trials and difficulties and distressing things that we grow
Yeah.
in our faith, in our emotional capacity. I say this a lot in couples work that when something comes easily to somebody, that may serve benefit to the relationship, but it doesn't show character. And it's usually not as rich of a reward as something that requires work. When you have a spouse that struggles a lot with, say, explosive anger,
Yeah.
as they're able to struggle towards implementing practical patience and practical self-control, that ends up being a much more fruitful thing than the person that finds being patient comes easily to them.
Right. Yeah.
Would you see that in your own work with
Yeah, I
couples?
would. I think that yes. And it's hard because I think there's a level, as we talk about couples work, de- depending on the issue at hand and what the person is struggling through, the spouse offended by the acts of the other may not have a ton of patience for them to struggle through. There needs to be, like, in a sense, some changes that happen more immediately,
Mhm.
safety structures put in place to allow healing to occur. But even in that, like, I would say that, um, let's say you have an affair recovery case.
Mm.
Um, Not all, because there's a lot of factors here, so I wanna be careful in how I say this, but, it's so tempting for couples or the person offended to, just leave, and to
Mm.
some level, again, I don't wanna go down crazy rabbit holes, but, like, to some level, there are exemptions to the laws of divorce as it relates to what Scripture says, what Christ says about divorce, and sexual immorality, and all that's rings true. But I've found that couples, or at least spouses that are willing to try to pursue reconciliation, to step into the very difficult places of rebuilding safety and trust with their spouse that offended them, if they come through that on the other side, there's such depth and strength within that relationship.
Mhm.
Um, Again, not all cases can do that because there's a lot
Yeah.
of factors of safety and trust that have to be put in place. But to use the anti-fragility mindset is the sense of someone choosing to step into the really, really difficult scenario for the hope of growth.
Mhm.
And that's essentially what I've seen within the couple sphere.
Yeah.
But I see it even in the sense of uh, the men I work with who struggle through maybe impulse control. You mentioned anger, but if there's any type of addictive behaviors,
Mhm.
they long for, especially in this culture, this day and time. There's awareness I have felt of the longing for the simple fixes. And maybe not simple is the right word, but like where I can just do this, this, and this, and it protects me from uh, ever looking at that again or moving to that substance again. Um, and sometimes they need to put boundaries in place to protect themselves, but the real hard work is that internal look to look at the heart that says, why am I choosing to go down these paths? Why do I need this action or this substance to do this stuff? And when they choose to do that kind of work, as difficult as it is, because it will expose a lot of stuff, um, that's where the true growth actually happens. That's where actually I've seen freedom happen for people that are stuck in addictive patterns.
Mhm.
So
Y
as it plays out and do these relational things, yes,
Yeah.
when we
You're
step into
touching
difficulty.
you're touching on the next point we're gonna talk about, which is embracing it. Uncertainty is part of as a
Mhm.
form of distress, and because as you're talking about men struggling with addiction in your example of wanting to know what's the thing that I can do that will
Yeah,
create certainty in
they're
my.
looking for the silver bullet that like they can feel certain in themselves that they're never going to do this action, or they can give to their spouse that says, "Look, I'm fixed.
Mhm.
I'm done."
Well, it's the and I appreciate the nuance you try to bring to things, and for people listening to us, whether new or you're a few episodes in with us, it may feel like we hedge a lot where it's like, "Oh, it's this," but it's kind of and if you're wondering that, we are,
Yeah.
because we believe there's nuance and we don't and we wanna be able to express things as accurately as we feel we know
Mhm.
them. But realizing that there are dynamics and exceptions, I talk about I wanna circle back to what I was saying about explosive anger,
Yeah.
because I wanna be clear in that I don't mean physical violence,
Yeah.
because if in couples work, if there's physical violence going on, that is a very how we handle that is a very different scenario, and I wouldn't be presenting that to the other spouse to be like, "Hey, this is a great opportunity for you to grow in distress."
Exactly. Yeah.
I and
Yeah.
because there does need to be this baseline of, uh we are mutually agreeing to walk together in a way that is just
Yeah.
with each other and to the relationship, whether that's in friendship, marriage, all that. And oftentimes there needs to be willingness to be patient. There needs to be time for healing, for forgiveness. That um, this doesn't embracing an anti-fragile mindset doesn't even mean that things will happen quick. I want to give another example of kind of this, and then kind of move on to what you were starting to talk about, Matt, which is the dynamics of uncertainty in dealing with
Right.
that. But
Mhm.
for me, um, my childhood in the context of that, I had a lot of positive things I experienced where I grew up with both my parents who were very supportive of me and loved me and expressed that in very practical ways. I did not grow up in material want. all the kind of main positive childhood things that you would ask for.
Yeah.
My struggle was in the context of school, that kindergarten was easy. Now, I'll give some context. Went to kindergarten in the mid-80s, and I think they expected a little less. I learned my letters. They're like, I could handle kindergarten. And as soon as I moved into first grade, it just fell on me. And it was I had a lot of, uh, what we would call neuroatypical things about me.
Mm,
You didn't have to know me very well as a little boy to know that I was a very different sort of kid, and I thought very differently. I know now that I have words for things I experience now. I a certain amount of ADHD, but much later in life discovered my dyslexia and how that really affected my learning processes.
right.
And I did not know how to learn in a typical sort of way, and I struggled from, uh, through, like, 1st grade till really about 10th, 11th grade, and what happened then finally in my later adolescence was I developed enough compensatory skills
Hmm.
in how my mind worked, that I didn't learn how to learn like other people did. I still don't know how to do that. I was able at that point to have built enough workarounds that I could function.
Yeah.
But school through those years caused me a lot of emotional distress,
Mm,
a lot. A sense of shame in the sense of not being able to uh, succeed in it, feeling of hopelessness. There was so many things in it. And even to this day, there are lots of things I have to be really ingenuitive with in figuring out how I'm going to figure it out.
wow.
Because I'll be presented with things I'm like, I I realize that other people can do it this way, but I'm probably gonna have to figure out another way around because my brain doesn't allow me to do that. And so it still represents difficulty. But I look at this experience of childhood
Yeah.
and I would not exchange it because what
Mm,
it formed in me as a creative person, as an empathetic person, I don't think I would have been led into this field if I had had a more typical experience that
mm,
was less distressing.
yeah.
And so I can look at that and still acknowledge the distress as distressing. I don't look back in that and think like, "Oh, that was really awesome." I'm like, "No, that was really difficult to go through."
Right.
But I have the sense on the other side, it is worth it.
Yeah.
When our To quote the solution-focused therapist and writer Elliott Connie, who's somebody whose work I really like, the solution-focused, therapy diamonds, one of his more recent books. But one of the things he talks about is that when, our pain has a purpose, it ceases to be as painful. Not that it
Mhm.
ceases to be painful altogether, but it ceases to be as painful.
Mhm.
So
Man. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that too, because I just think it shows that there are things with all of our life, no matter if it is learning difficulties or loss of a parent or
mm,
challenges of the socioeconomic place that you've come from. Anytime that we embrace, not, and again, I think it's similar to what you had said. It's not embrace these challenges as like these are great. Like I love that they're here, but embrace them in the sense of I am hopeful for what this produces in me.
mm,
And even in the sense of I don't know if this is where we go in the certainty piece, but so much of Scripture I think talks about, um, back to we may have said this one in a recent podcast, but in this world you all have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. Like Jesus says to us, no matter our status or sin or whatever, that trouble still is present. Um, but it's also an opportunity, I think, is for us to lean into uh, Christ's comfort and compassion and wisdom to see us through whatever the difficulty is. Um,
mhm, absolutely.
yeah, yeah,
And moving to the concept of what we've alluded to already of seeing uncertainty in this. The distress can look like a lot of things, but in the age that we live in, oftentimes it's uncertainty. I don't know where this person is. I don't know
yeah,
what's going to happen in this. And by living in uncertainty as Christians, we are forced to rely on God's sovereignty in different ways.
mm,
because we can believe it in a more abstract sort of way when we feel that we are managing the levers of our own lives. But when we are forced in big and small ways to not be able to see the end of the road we're walking down.
Yeah, or to lose control.
Yeah. And or to feel like we're out of control. So
Right.
two scriptures I want to highlight. Matt, if you do the first one, which is Proverbs 3:5-6.
Yeah, it says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. Think about him in all your ways, and he will guide you on the right paths."
Mm. What I will read is Isaiah 55:8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. This is the Lord's declaration. For as heaven is higher than earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Uncertainty being tied to surrender. And from a completely secular psychotherapeutic approach, this is how things work. When you are working with somebody as a therapist who deals with obsessive anxiety, how you help them get over that is you create deliberate exposures to the anxiety.
Mhm.
It is not because oftentimes what they're doing to try to alleviate their distress and discomfort is they avoid the things that make them anxious. But that because their emotions are anti-fragile, they're not fragile, they're anti-fragile. They need distress to thrive. And
Yeah,
because they're treating something that is really anti-fragile as fragile, it makes it more fragile. And somebody who experiences social anxiety in different situations where they feel anxious, sometimes even to the level of panic attack of being in certain situations. Oftentimes, what that leads them to do is avoid those situations. But that has the effect of shrinking their capacity to
yeah,
engage in the world.
yeah,
And where that can eventually lead, it doesn't for everybody, but where it can eventually lead is what is called agoraphobia, which is somebody who has panic just to be out in the world in any sort of way. And they become basically homebound. And even then, they're experiencing anxiety in their home, but the idea of leaving their home and the uncertainty of that,
yeah,
and that often doesn't happen all at once. Often it comes from they start avoiding certain things, but then that leads them to avoid more things. And again, we can acknowledge a lot of things as distressing. There are any numbers of social situations or interactions that I do not enjoy and I
yeah,
don't actively seek out. But I think it's important that I have a capacity within at least certain boundaries to interact with them. Because
mhm,
if I give that fear headship, then that makes it sovereign in my life
yeah,
versus and my goal is not to make me sovereign because if I recognize myself as finite, one of our early episodes, Matt and I talked about the idea of God centered versus person centered or us centered. And when we are trying to manage our own uh, lives by knowing and intervening and stopping any discomforting variables, we will be overwhelmed and lost and ultimately
yeah,
unsuccessful.
right. Yeah. This is really good. I think it's challenging for us to consider ways that maybe we've been called into the difficult. Um, I know for myself, I'm wrestling with times that I've avoided difficult things because they felt like too much.
Mm.
Um, but maybe as we kind of have a few more minutes left, what would be some practical ways we can encourage others to kind of engage this
Mhm.
moving forward from the theoretical maybe to the practical?
Always want to put legs to it when we can.
Yeah.
I think in for any person, doing an inventory of where you feel the fear in your life and where you feel you're trying to control, either to avoid distress or to create certainty. And it happens to all of us.
Yeah.
And that's not something just in this age. I think all of us throughout the age of humanity have struggled with managing uncertainty and the lack of our own ability to make our lives exactly as we want
Right.
those our lives to be. But we live in an age where we've been given so many levers and
Mm.
so many tools to to inquire new knowledge, to manage the things in our lives. I am sitting in a temperature controlled room. It is set to be a specific range of degrees Fahrenheit,
Mhm.
and that just feels normal to me. There's most of my life is inhabited in
Yeah.
places that I can do that with,
Yeah.
and that's weird in the context of human history, and
That's
yeah, and
yeah.
so thinking about where am I embracing uncertainty and distress in my life in ways that can lead to goodness.
Mm.
For the parents out there, my encouragement is to be thinking about what am I trying to protect my kids from? And is what I am doing leading to my ultimate goal? If your goal as a parent is, I want my children to be able to grow and to thrive independently, are you creating the context for that? And that does involve thinking through, am I rescuing them? What are the ways I'm trying to rescue them? And
Right.
what and in acknowledging that if I withhold this, if I don't intervene, I might feel bad. I might feel bad because I feel I'm failing as a parent.
Right.
I might feel bad empathetically because I see how upsetting this is to my kids, and I
Mm.
want to save them from it.
Mm.
But loving something or somebody greatly involves being able to see past a specific moment.
Mm.
As I said earlier, I was not pleased at all that my cat was upset with me and with the idea of being dragged off to the vet. But
Right.
I chose to care for my cat more
Mm.
not to do that. You know,
Yeah.
if your kid is getting an injection at the doctor and they're crying and
Yep.
hysterical and all that,
Yep.
you can feel upset. You're allowed to feel upset as a parent about that,
Yeah.
but you can still accept that this is a needed thing that they're doing.
Well, I think that's a helpful example too, because it shows even for parents maybe listening that there are ways that I have or chosen. What's the grammatical correctness there?
In
I
in
I
past tense, I have chosen.
I have chosen. Thank you. That's not my degree, by the way. So I have chosen to take him or her to the doctor to get their updated shots, to get a checkup, to even, I don't know if anyone listening has had a child go through surgery, but
Mm,
that is a very difficult reality to sit in. Um, when they take him away and you can't do anything,
mm,
but it's the right move. It's going to cause pain and it's going to cause fear and it's going to cause confusion, but it's the right thing for the health of the child. So we do those things, and I don't think I don't think we realize that's what we're doing. And so we need to remember one, that we already somewhat do it,
mhm,
and then two, to look at other ways, maybe especially socially, relationally, um, even kind of motivationally. I don't know how to maybe say that. I think we need to look at ways as parents to see, okay, how am I stepping in too quickly when they really need me to maybe be on the other end to sit with them in whatever the pain that is caused. I just had a conversation with a parent about that. Trying to assess the way to be a parent, not a coach. Kind
mm,
of like to be there with their child rather than kind of clear out all obstacles before the pain occurs. And so I just echo those things about the parenting aspect. I think that's where it's going to hit most home for a lot of people listening.
mhm. As we wrap up, also the last thing I want to do is if you're interested in this and want more practical sorts of things, like Matt and I have just sort of unpacked the concept.
Yeah.
And we want to touch a little bit on some ways to implement, but you'll probably if you've been intrigued by the concept, you're probably interested in more. And this is some of the things that we have more training on in our free community library
Mhm.
that we highlight in every episode. And so if you can find access to that on our website, churchpsychology.org.
Yeah.
It's housed within the Gev Institute, which is what Matt and I are a part of, and which puts on this podcast.
Mhm.
And because we don't desire to just shame people for doing it wrong. We really want to give people avenues and tools and things like that to consider if how to do it differently. if you accept this, if this idea resonates, and
Mm.
as you learn more about it and it resonates more, that huh, distress and difficulty can have fruitful things in the lives of the
Yeah.
myself and the people I care about. How do I begin to put form to that?
Mm.
I want you to have those resources, and so certainly
Yeah.
check the community library. It's free, churchpsychology.org.
That's really good. Well, as we wrap up, I want to share this is so we were talking about I think I knew we were talking about this today, but I read this scripture this morning kind of in a quiet time. Um, so this is Proverbs 17:3. It says, "The crucible is for silver, and the furnace is for gold, and the Lord tests hearts." And that mindset, as I read that, was these precious metals that God is refining have to be put through such challenging spaces
Mm.
to grow and to become that which they're supposed to be. And so I think that that was such a reminder for me that when I hit these hard points in life, um, I am being refined to be more of who I'm supposed to be. So I'll leave people with that. And we are so grateful that you would listen
Mm.
and to be a part of this conversation with us. Again, let us know your thoughts, ask us some questions, and we look forward to bringing more to you soon. So, David,
Matt,
always a pleasure.
always.
We will talk to you next time.
Yeah.
Thank you again for being a part of our latest episode of Church Psychology. If you have enjoyed it, we hope that you will share this episode with others in your life. And please do remember to follow, like, and or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you're finding us, and leave us a review. We look forward to connecting with you again soon.